So I'm looking at the elusive public and public education, and I just think I am the public. Right? I'm a mother of 8. I have three grandchildren. I'm from New York City. I'm the public. The parents that we organize with are the public. The organization that I'm part of, the Alliance for Quality Education, works statewide with the public. But often those voices, especially those if you're a public of someone who lives in a high poverty area or you're a person of color, your voice is totally devalued, and you're thought of as not necessarily speaking for yourself, but you're speaking for the union. Ooh, bad union, right? And that could be nothing further from the truth. We are parents just like everyone else. We are community members. We fight for not only education equity, we fight for jobs in our communities, and so much more. But the dynamic that has been created currently under this divide and conquer, this kind of separate and unequal space we live in right now in regards to education must change. Because ultimately, and what we've seen and continue to see, is that the children, especially children of color, become collateral damage in the process. And so when we talk about public and ensuring that we value that word, we value that word for so many things. The fact that education is becoming that space where we're talking about private anything is very scary, because I know the history. I know the people who came before us that stood, who sacrificed life, who were beaten, and everything else to ensure that everyone, black people specifically, but everyone had the opportunity to an equitable, a fair education, one that was going to prepare them for now and the future. And yet we are turning the tide on so many of those things. And that is not separate from the fact that we are looking at historical laws being overturned, like affirmative action, that we are seeing voter ID laws being pushed. These are the same folks that are doing the same thing around privatization. And I'm going to say this, and I'm going to say it once, because what happens when you critique anything in regards to charters is that you automatically are kind of branded as you're either for or against. And I would challenge to say that as a parent, as a taxpayer, and as a citizen, that anything that has to do with children, it is our obligation and our responsibility to challenge and critique it, and not just take anything at face value. Having said that, it is very scary to see. As in New York City, we organized, the public organized, the parents organized, 12 years of Mayor Bloomberg under his regime of favoring charters and totally putting our public schools as the stepchild of the families, pretty much, as a black sheep. Anything that was negative, it was out there, right? And he was the champion for it. And there's one thing to be a champion for something, is another thing to neglect the others. And that was the majority of children in the system. We organized, we have a new mayor now who championed and walked the walk on fairness and equity, and was overwhelmingly voted for that. Why? Because people in this country, not only in New York, wanted to hear somebody talk about fairness and equity for a change. And it wasn't just about education, it was so many other things, so many ills that we still are facing right now. So when we talk about the public overwhelmingly decided that this was the way we wanted to go. So we have this opportunity. March of this year, every year that rolls around, that state budget time happens, and we organize hundreds and sometimes thousands of people to go up to Albany. And that conversation around educational equity was at the forefront again. And we were calling for a $2 billion investment in education. No one had ever said, what do we need to educate kids? What is that dollar figure in New York State to educate children? And so we, as AQE, said, let's put up that dollar figure. It was a $1.9 billion ask, right? Because our schools had been seeing overwhelming cuts year after year, and they were hemorrhaging around the state, hemorrhaging. They couldn't provide art and music. They were unable to provide advanced placement courses. Some schools were losing their whole bands. Thousands of teachers were being lost, which means you can't provide programs for those children anymore. And we said, we're going to organize, and we got people up there to Albany. And the conversation was totally hijacked. It was totally hijacked. In the last month, in March, the 1%, the kind of hedge funders who want to just continue to keep charters at the forefront and not talk about all children, put $5 million in 30 days in ads. $5 million. That's more than a mayoral campaign, right? So when we talk about what is this is really about in regards to public and shutting down public, right? $5 million to hijack the budget cuts. And, our mayor, our governor, who we, as AQE, titled Quid Pro Quo, clearly you had to pay to play, right? Because not only did they put those $5 million in ads, they also had contributed much money to his reelection campaign right now as it stands. And the public was up there. Parents and students were up there saying, we need to fund all schools. Let's get back to funding the campaign for fiscal equity. The promise was never fulfilled. Our kids are losing X, Y, and Z. Our teachers are being slashed and cut. Like, we need to begin to solve what's happening in our schools. We know what it is. Fund our schools so we can provide the resources and programs that our children need. And we had to do that. I've never experienced, and I've been going up to Albany for quite a few years. I've never experienced such disappointment, right, in legislators, and realizing that money was really ruling at that point. But it was about hammering home the messaging. It was talking about exactly what we were going to lose if we didn't have that funding. But in the end, on March 31st, while we did get more money in the school aid budget than we were expected, or the governor thought we would get, almost twice as much, there was some really controversial and devastating charter legislation that was bartered in the process, specifically to New York City, right? And so we're still working on that. But I think it just goes to show, like, that money piece is something that's really, really key. But it doesn't stop us, right? I think to Jeff's point, the organizing part is what we do. It is our life and blood, because it is what gives us hope in a moment when sometimes things feel hopeless. And how we envision public education and why it is so important is because we envision public education not as it is, but as we want it to be, as anybody would want it to be, where we are ensuring that there's, our children from 3 and 4 have quality early childhood education, right? And that it's not defined as babysitting, because that's the conversation that's happening. When parents of color want something, parents living in poverty, guess what? The code words begin to start talking about, oh, isn't that just dedicated child care? But when white middle-class parents want to find a great space for their kids, it's called preschool, right? So how do we begin to have those conversations in a real honest way, right? Community schools. In New York City, and in your package, you'll have something. The Coalition for Educational Justice, one of the leading parent organizations in New York City, predominantly Black and Latino parents, working for the last 8 years almost in communities of color to really change policy. Community schools, let's talk about what that looks like. It's not about charter or public. What does a community school entail? It ensures that children have the opportunity, if they need to get immunization, if they need hearing and eye exams. Many eons ago when I was in school, we automatically had eye exams and we had hearing tests. Totally was cut and stripped, right? That you are not only engaging in those spaces for those children to be healthy, but the community is wrapped around that school as it should be. So as we've experienced 162 school closures in New York City under Mayor Bloomberg, 162, you cannot think that they don't have devastating results on community. Because our schools are our hub, or at least they used to be. And how do we get back to that, right? Public, community, how do we make sure that those things are happening? And at the same time that you're able to provide all those social and emotional supports, those college counselors, that children feel safe in those spaces, that teachers feel are getting professional development, meaningful professional development to hone their skill, to build themselves up so they can be better, right? Always improving, always improving. Everybody wants that, right? That parents are engaged, they're a core part of that, that the community, those very communities that often all they hear are the bad, what your community can't offer, what's not happening, that failing school, right? Everything is failing. If those if those kids just cared about their education, now you are creating a space where they can see the positives. They don't have to read the bad. They can say, you know what? We have great things happening in our schools, our public schools, right, that we can all attend. That coupled with that is the academic piece. Because it's great if their kids, it's fine that they're getting mental services and others, but if the academic piece is not a core of that, then what's the purpose, right? That's how we envision our public schools to be. So how do we get to the conversation of making that? Because that's not what the conversation is on a national level, right? So being part of the National Alliance Journey for Justice, AQE, we were here yesterday in D.C. In collaboration, working together, imagine, not competing, working together with labor, AFT, NEA, SEIU, parents and students from all across the country. Many of those cities and states that you've heard devastating things happening, Detroit, Chicago, New Orleans, Philly, Newark, New York City, came together to release our report, right? A report that you can get online if you go to the Journey for Justice Alliance. And it talks about what the public and what parents are saying about these misguided and really devastating policies that are being passed down. And charter expansion at the expense of communities and what's happening, right? So what does the public say? So this is a grandfather from New Orleans. Unlike the rest of Louisiana, we don't have a local school board. We can't go to the recovery school district. The recovery school district provides no real representation that we have control of. There's no say so in the schools. Citizens, especially parents, are victims because they end up in schools that are dumping grounds, right? A parent from DC, public, right? Since our school closed, we haven't had any consistency in teachers. We've had award-winning teachers leave our school, great administrators leave our school, and it's to the point where my children are wondering if it's something they've done to run staff and their favorite teachers away. This is the impact of what we're doing right now in regards to education and public education. These are the people that no one ever asks, well, we're opening up more charters, or, you know, we're going to do this, or vouchers, or we're closing more of your schools. How's it working? How's it going? We're not giving you money. We're cutting your budgets by millions of dollars. Is that working good for you? No one ever asks, right? But that's historic. No one ever asks. We decided to ask those parents. We decided to ask those students that were actually either still in a closing school, had experienced a closing school, or just were community members or teachers or educators that have been part of the conversation around, or lack of conversation, I should say, around the real effects of what's been happening in regards to education. And I would just dare to say that racism plays a major role in this as well. So what I want to do before my time is up is show this video, because I think it addresses and talks about the public and what we've said. And I just also want to say that the community members that are part of AQE and this National Alliance Journey for Justice have been organizing for decades. So when you have someone like a Arnie Duncan who can come in and just assume that because a school system hasn't been successful, that the community members have not been advocating for something better, the public school system they want it to be, then I think that says a lot. And I'll just say this. This is Arnie Duncan. I'm sure many of you heard about it, this or comment he says, where he talks about, I spent a lot of time in New Orleans, and this is a tough thing to say, but I'm going to be really honest. So he's honest. He's being honest about what he says. The best thing that happened to the education system in New Orleans was Hurricane Katrina. That education system was a disaster, and it took Hurricane Katrina to wake up the community, to see that we have to do it better. And the progress that it made in 4 years since the hurricane is unbelievable. Long way to go, but that city was not serious about education. Right? If you read our report, you'll see that it has not been a success. And when you hear people talk about the success of New Orleans, you need to challenge them and say, I talk to parents. I've seen parents who talk about students who share that this has not been a success, that they are fighting tooth and nail for their survival, that our children are literally dying, no exaggeration, all across this country, in Chicago, in New York City, in Detroit. The violence is totally in connection to closures and the disinvestment in our communities. Absolutely, there's no doubt about that. But there will be people that would have you think it's not. So if we really are going to focus on putting the public back in conversations, right? If we're really going to focus about really educating children as a whole, then let's talk to those most impacted. Because whether we have a college degree, an 8th grade education, speak the language or not, we know what we want for our children, we know what works best for our children, but at the same time, no one asks us. So I'm hoping the tech person will run the video. I think it's just like a brief 3-minute video.
They are here to get the truth today, and they do not want to hear it. So, of course, that's why we're standing outside. We've been planning this since September of last year, even before then, so they knew we were coming. Look at all the security and extra precautions they've taken.
on the, the specific issue around school closings, it's obviously a really, really hard one. And I would tell you, I don't know any educators, any political leaders who wake up in the morning and say, we want to close some schools.
There are many cities that we're working with around the country to say that the voices of the people directly impacted can no longer be ignored. They can no longer be ignored.
Racism is well and alive in this country. We are the descendants of slaves. We are now reversing back to slavery. Backwards never, forward ever. All of you can remember those words.
I hear people say all the time that this generation is lost and this generation is failing, but this generation is not lost. This generation has been neglected.
CPS has closed 100 schools and opened 100 charter and 19 contract schools. Schools like Lakeview have 12 AP classes, while Dyer has 0. They have darkroom photography and jazz, while Dyer students had to take art online.
The Philadelphia School Reform Commission wants to close 37 schools, which will displace over 7,000 students. The school closing will only save 1% of their budget.
A 2009 study documented that only 6% of displaced students transferred to high-performing schools, while 80% went to underperforming ones.
I have 2 children who have learning disabilities, and so as a parent, when I see that the governor of our state takes money from education and then funnels it into prisons, I just want to let you know that Governor Corbett has worked. My oldest son, who's 16, special ed student, is now in prison.
Education is the only sword that can penetrate and pierce through the heart of poverty.
Right.
The only strike of liberty that can eliminate racism and injustice for people across this great nation. This is the next civil rights movement. Today it begins.
Now, what we want to happen, we recommend a moratorium on charter schools, school closures, phase-outs, and co-locations. We got to stop this. We recommend that the United States Department of Education use the Sustainable Schools Transformation Model as one of the turnaround strategies for underperforming schools. And we demand an immediate investigation of our civil rights, our Title VI civil rights complaints. Thank you.
The people who came in to take our school, instead of asking about the quality of work and what goes on in our school, they'll say, oh, how much space do we have? How many stairwells can be split down the middle for these children? Yes. Right in front of our faces. Yes. I felt totally and utterly disrespected. Yes. And the DOE is to blame.
So that was a hearing that the Journey for Justice Alliance had last January. Again, we brought about 500 parents and students in. Duncan stayed for about 20 minutes, and you saw it was, it was hard, I think, for people to contain themselves, just in his opening around, of course, these are hard times, and people have a hard time dealing with decisions like this. And I think his comment around around New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina is very startling, because this is the person that's running this education system as we see it right now. And we need to get back to ensuring that we are talking about really engaging parents and community, and that includes young people. Young people are walking out of schools by the hundreds, by the thousands, because of what's happening in their schools, because of the cuts that they're receiving, that states are not investing them anymore. And as the states disinvest, obviously you can't provide programs, and when you can't provide programs, the quote-unquote test scores don't go up, but there's no accountability or responsibility for those who are cutting these budgets. And it becomes a prime opportunity now for those who want to privatize to say, see, look, these public schools aren't performing, so therefore we must close them. Therefore, we have a better way to do this. And it has become all about the dollar. It has become all about the dollar. And it's not just in education, so we see it across the board, right? Everything is about how do we privatize, because private must be better than public. But I'm the public. So how could something private be better than me? How could something private be better than the students in those buildings? How could something private be better than those teachers that are actually teaching those children? So we must challenge when we hear people talk about privatizing things, because my thought is always, when that person doesn't want to, when the Gates of the world or the Koch brothers or others decide they want to invest their money back in pork bellies, and they want to take it out of charter schools, where does that leave our children? The public will be gone. We need to make sure we keep that public alive.